So good morning, everyone. My name is Rita Larkin. I am the Communications Director for the Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation, and this webinar is about agriculture on the Blue Ridge Parkway. If you've ever been traveling the parkway and seen cattle off in the distance or seen a hay field, that's kind of added to the beauty of the view, this is the right webinar for you. We are going to talk about the agriculture program. Those places are definitely on federal land. So it's a very interesting, unique program. Today, we have Dr. Mark Spond. He is the Appalachian State University Liaison to the National Park Service, which gives him some interesting collaborations between the university and the national park, and particularly the Blue Ridge Parkway, and that is why he is going to be talking to us about this program and how his students have played a role in monitoring these places on the parkway. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Spond.
Thank you, Rita. Thank you all for taking the time to listen to my presentation today. I'm going to use the share screen mode to bring up my PowerPoint. Hopefully all of you are able to see that now. As Rita pointed out, I'm an employee of Appalachian State University. I'll give a little bit more information about myself in the next slide. But my primary goal, in addition to teaching our students, is to facilitate projects, cooperative agreements, and so forth with the National Park Service. And here a little bit later in the presentation, I'm going to talk about one of those cooperative agreements, a project that led us to collaborating with the Parkway to do some assessment, basically assist the Parkway in their assessment of some agricultural parcels that are adjacent to the Parkway itself. So in my title here, you can see I'm talking about protecting agricultural resources along the Parkway, but beyond just protecting the agricultural parcels, hopefully you'll see that this program is really geared to protect the historical and cultural heritage and the associated resources with that on the Parkway, and kind of having a beneficial spillover effect, providing some suitable habitat for some of our wildlife species like ground dwelling birds and pollinators. So it's a project that specifically deals with agricultural resources. Yet if we kind of broaden our perspective out, we could see that it really addresses much of the resource protection objectives of the Parkway staff. What is the App State Liaison to the National Park Service? That's a fair question. I'm a geographer with a kind of an eclectic background when it comes to education. I guess you could say that my background is really in American history and in American geography, with most of my professional experience being in the American Southwest than here in the Southeastern US. I'm a native of Arkansas, but I earned a PhD at the University of Tennessee and have been living in the Appalachian region for about 15 years and certainly consider it my home and hope to consider it my home for many, many years to come. I teach in the Department of Geography and Planning at App State, but my broader role is within the College of Arts and Sciences to help facilitate cooperative agreements with the National Park Service. Since I came into this role in 2013, I've helped facilitate numerous volunteer events along Blue Ridge Parkway. I've been able to manage cooperative agreements through both National Park Service youth programs and the Cooperative Ecosystem Studies Units program. This particular project I'm talking about today was through a youth programs agreement. This has brought in over $300,000 in salaries, hourly wages, for our students and recent graduates. So these are paid internships that we provide our students, more than 30 of them in the past 8 years, that allows them a chance to bring their classroom expertise to the National Park Service setting and see if a National Park Service career is something they want to pursue after graduation. Most of this work has been in Great Smoky Mountains, Shenandoah National Park, and especially Blue Ridge Parkway. But we have worked with some other Park Service units as well. Right now, we're finishing up 2 interns working at Kings Mountain National Military Park in South Carolina. We've also had folks at Cowpens and a few other places. So our emphasis is very much on the southeastern United States, where we have a really broad array of different National Park Service units, including the Blue Ridge Parkway, which really, in my opinion, ties together the Park Service objectives of protecting cultural, historical, and natural resources, and allowing for the public to enjoy those resources. This is a question I had to ask myself 4 or 5 years ago when I was first approached about the project I'll be talking about today. And that question is, why does the National Park Service issue agricultural permits along the Blue Ridge Parkway? And I'll go ahead and make the distinction and apologize if I make the mistake during this presentation of referring to these agreements as leases. Just about everybody kind of colloquially refers to them, myself included, as agricultural leases, and that's technically not correct. The concept of a lease has a very specific meaning in the Department of the Interior, and these are really permitted parcels where individuals are able to apply for permitted agricultural use for 5-year periods. So it's different than a formal lease arrangement with an outside party. Well, to kind of very quickly give some main bulleted points to answer that question of why does the National Park Service issue these permits, it would be these 3 bulleted points you see here on the screen. One is that from its inception, the designers of the Blue Ridge Parkway did not want it to be a forested tunnel. Of course, here in the southeastern United States, we're primarily dealing with closed canopy forests, and a scenic parkway moving through those forests would have its views both in the short distance and the long distance restricted by those closed canopy forests. So the early designers of the parkway did not want it to be a forested tunnel. They wanted to allow the views to extend out to greater distances. The early designers of the parkway also wanted to preserve the pastoral and agricultural heritage of this region at a time when people were leaving the mountain country to go to more urbanized centers for factory jobs or other employment opportunities. There was an effort here to engage those people to preserve their existing way of life, and in many instances, improve upon the techniques that were being employed for raising cattle or growing crops, basically introducing what today we would consider best practices in agriculture onto these permitted sites adjacent to the parkway. So it was preserving practices that had been going on for decades here with the local mountain people, and also engaging the community in ways that would help them to better pursue those agricultural objectives. And also provide them a greater sense of a connectedness to the parkway itself. Of course, as land was being taken through eminent domain and concerns with local folks were ever present, that this parkway was kind of excluding them from the equation in terms of where it went and how it could be accessed. This was a way to kind of show that those local folks had not been completely forgotten in the design of this new parkway through lands that they had maybe been living on for decades. I mentioned the parkway, and I've used the term design several times. The Blue Ridge Parkway is not managed as a wilderness. It is a designed landscape. And one of the most influential designers, of course, is Stanley Abbott, who at not even 30 years old was named the Parkway's first resident landscape architect and the first acting superintendent. And Abbott kind of is coming out of this school of thought, this idea of a very aesthetic approach to certain grand scenes or grand structures of this being kind of complemented by increased use of the automobile and driving in automobiles as a form of recreation in itself. So Abbott brought that kind of mindset of the designed landscape and the designed experience as one travels by automobile through that landscape to what was constructed at Blue Ridge Parkway. You can see there's a quote here: "Not all people realize that farmlands are I'm paraphrasing here, adding to the charm of this location," but Abbott certainly felt like it did. The orchards, the farmlands, the animal husbandry added to the experience that he and others sought to design for visitors along the parkway. So this permit system has been around since the very beginning of the parkway, and it's been in effect for over 70 years. Today, there are, if we look at the entire 469 miles of the Blue Ridge Parkway, there are 405 parcels totaling up to about 3,600 acres. Most of these parcels are in the Plateau region of Southern Virginia and the Highlands region of Northern North Carolina. The parcels are used for livestock grazing, growing hay, and a very small number of them are used for cropland, growing things like corn, pumpkins, cabbage. Those are going to be smaller parcels that in some cases are as small as a 1/4 acre. If you look at some of the parcels where cattle's being grazed, that's where our bigger parcels up to 101 acres can be found. Each of these parcels is permitted for 5 years. Permit holders must prohibit woodland encroachment, so they have to make sure that you don't have tree seedlings establishing. You have to make sure that you don't have rhododendron encroaching onto the open areas. They have to maintain fences. They have to exclude invasive species. They're supposed to try to promote grazing practices that discourage erosion or damage to riparian or wetland areas. And doing all this at the same time in a way that still provides them the yield from their livestock that is makes them feel like it's a worthwhile economic endeavor for them. And then, of course, for the visitors to the parkway, it kind of provides this pastoral landscape, again, designed landscape that many of us, myself included, kind of find as an enjoyable alternative to the beautiful forest we have, but kind of an open alternative that allows us to see greater distances at both mountain peaks or looking at the road in the distance or anything else. This is a small item of revenue for the parkway each year. It brings in about $35,000 in revenue for the parkway. A modest amount of money, but when you think about the parkway now having over 14 million visitors a year and no entrance fee being charged those 14 million visitors, any little bit of income the parkway can receive is going to be beneficial. There's 4 pictures right here, contemporary photographs of some of these agricultural parcels along the parkway. You can see somewhere in the lower left-hand corner, we see cattle grazing. In the lower right-hand corner, in the upper part, you can see fences. Of course, maintenance of fences is a huge job, and that's one of the things that required of the permit holders is to maintain fences in order to keep livestock concentrated in areas where they're supposed to be and out of places where they're not supposed to be. But you can see the effect here. In many places, the parkway corridor is just a matter of a couple of 100 feet wide. By having these agricultural parcels that are maintained in ways that are similar to the adjacent property, kind of gives this I don't want to say illusion, but it kind of gives us this vision of a continued landscape out to the horizon, where in reality the actual parkway land might only be a few hundred meters or so wide, but because it's managed in an agricultural state that is similar to the adjacent landowners' management uses, it kind of gives this appearance of a greater continuity of landscape going out into the distance. During the summer of 2018, 3 Appalachian State interns working under a cooperative agreement between Appalachian State and the Blue Ridge Parkway did an assessment, or I should say they did the observations that were later used by the National Park Service in order to assess 97 parcels, about 964 acres of agricultural permit land between mileposts 248 and 298 on the parkway. So this is all in the northern part of North Carolina, roughly the area Dalton Park down towards Moses Cone and Price Park areas. So I'll show you some pictures of our interns in just a second out in the field collecting the data. But what was done is after the data were collected and brought back to the National Park Service staff then created visualizations of the data that were collected, comparable to what you see right here on the left. This is a picture of it's an aerial photograph where you can see some of the data recording steps mapped out on that aerial image. You can see the starting and end point that the interns walked. So what they did is they did a fence post to fence post walk, as it's sometimes called, walking through these parcels, taking pictures at certain places. They would take a GPS point of where the picture was taken, basically providing an archive of what conditions are like at that point, so that in the future people can come after them and re-photograph those scenes and make comparisons to see if there's any apparent degradation that has occurred in the interim, or if there's any positive dynamics that could be observed as well. So this is kind of what the visual output looks like right here. In addition to mapping out the path that they took through the parcel and GPSing where the photos were taken, they also kind of delineate certain types of land cover, whether it's a forested area, a stream, or other riparian environment, to give the Park Service a little more information about how to perhaps manage those areas that are a little bit different than what's found in just kind of the open sections of the parcel. Of the 97 parcels that the App State interns looked at, 41 of them were pasture land for cattle, 30 were for growing hay, 22 were mixed hay and pasture land, and then just a handful of them were small garden plots. The assessment, which again, the National Park Service is really who's doing the assessment here. Our interns are out collecting data for assessment, but the kind of metric that's being used in the assessment is something called the USDA Pasture Condition Score, and this is a very widely used system for rating the conditions of pastures, and then using those ratings to using a numerical score to make a decision about what management strategies need to be employed moving forward. If we look at, so what are they looking at when they're looking at these USDA pasture condition scores? So they're looking at riparian conditions. How are our streams? How are our bogs? How, if there's any fens or other wetlands in the area, how are they holding up in the presence of any kind of agricultural activity near them? How is erosion? How is that doing? Do we have sheet erosion across the slopes themselves? Do we have little rills and gullies forming? Do we have stream banks that are highly compromised? Do we have invasive species like thistle or multifloral rose moving in? Or do we have encroachment by trees and rhododendron? Do we have plant diversity that is suited for wildlife species as well as suited for grazers like cattle? And do we see any human encroachment or trespassing? And I know sometimes that term trespassing sounds really like, oh, these people, they're trespassing on this land, but in many cases, I think we have hundreds of different property owners adjacent to Parkway lands with the boundary maybe not being crystal clear. Somebody's maybe has a fence that's a foot one way more than it should be, or they have some cuttings that they put now next to their property, but it's actually on Parkway land. So oftentimes fairly subtle things, evidence of people kind of encroaching over the boundary, in this case into pasture land or other agricultural lands along the Parkway. If you look at the scoring, this kind of gives you these points are based off of the data that are collected along the different categories and a few others that I just mentioned. But basically, the higher the score, the less management changes or less management, less agricultural future exclusions need to be employed. The lower the score, the more that needs to be done, and the more that needs to be done quickly. So to collect these data, like I said, our interns, and you can see all three of them right here, Mariah, Joey, and Tyler, out walking fence post to fence post, taking pictures, taking GPS points, collecting descriptive data that's later to be used in assessments by the National Park Service. And of course, along the way, encountering some of the livestock that are, or at least part of the year, 6 months or so out of the year, living out on these pastures. Sometimes they found some other things that were a little bit different than what would be expected out on these agricultural tracks. This is an example of Joey Beretti finding a 1940s era Chevrolet out on one of these parcels. And the question then comes in, well, should this be moved? How long has it been there? Is it an artifact that's protected under the Antiquities Act? And so I think it's kind of when we see things like this that may initially seem out of place along the Blue Ridge Parkway, maybe if we kind of think back to this concept of this being a designed landscape, this being a landscape that has been heavily impacted by people since the inception of the Parkway in that design process, we can see that stuff like this old car that might seem out of place actually is more part of the historical story here than might initially be expected. This is a picture of the largest agricultural tract on the Moses Cone Estate. This is a 100-acre pasture parcel. I'm sure many folks listening today are familiar with this. You can see the carriage trails there on the Moses Cone Estate going through this parcel. But this is where things like erosion, vegetation makeup, invasive species, fence conditions, all of that is being assessed by the Park Service in order to make the decision about whether or not a person or persons are able to keep their agricultural permit, or in some cases, whether or not a permit that parcel needs to maybe be kind of sunsetted, no longer used in the system, and set aside for some other kind of resource management purpose. This would be an example of something that is going to get the attention of the Park Service right here, something that is not desirable and is going to result in a lower pasture condition score. So this is a stream crossing where cattle are accessing the stream in order to drink water. And you can see there's quite a bit of erosion going down to the bank with some collapse of the bank itself. That erosion, that sediment gets into the stream. It changes that's going to affect the stream temperature. It can affect the stream chemistry. And of course, that's going to potentially have negative impacts on other aquatic life downstream. So this is something that the Park Service is looking to avoid and looking to mitigate by perhaps restricting access by cattle to this point right here, or looking for other mitigation techniques within the parcel that would prohibit this from getting any worse, and ideally allow it to be, I'm careful using the term restored here, but allow it to rehabilitate to some degree. There have been dozens and dozens of efforts along streams, along the parkway, including within these agricultural permit parcels to restore or rehabilitate damaged or in this case eroded streams. So this is something that perhaps would need some sort of effort to attempt to restore the structure and function of the stream at this point. So this would not get a very good score in the assessment by the Park Service. If we look at the 97 parcels that our App State interns collected data for, I would say as a whole, it's an encouraging picture. More than, see, we have 75 of the parcels being assessed as either excellent or good, with those higher pasture scores suggesting that there's less that needs to be done in order to retain the characteristics that allows them for agricultural use and the benefit of other resources like wildlife. And then you see that we did have a handful, just 5 that were rated as fair or poor, needs immediate management attention, high likely return. In many cases, this had to do with cattle grazing and damages to riparian areas by cattle. That's not to say that that was the case in all places. There's not in this project, but in a previous assessment, there was some evidence to suggest that light cattle grazing in some wetlands might actually be beneficial to our southern bog turtles, from the perspective of it helps keep out woody encroachment, helps keeps the habitat intact in a way for the bog turtles to persist. Habitat that otherwise would have to be maintained by some outside mechanical forces that are probably powered by fossil fuels. So it's hard to say right off the bat that cattle are always bad for riparian areas, and you certainly wouldn't say that they're always good for riparian areas, but in certain instances and looking at certain taxa, there's not always a complete negative overlap between the presence of cattle and the survivorship of other parkway resources. So maintaining these agricultural parcels, keeping them open rather than closed canopy forests, is not just beneficial for preserving the historic landscape or the desired experience of travelers that Stanley Abbott had. It's not just beneficial for preserving agricultural way of life or engaging the community. It also has real benefits for wildlife species that inhabit the parkway, particularly birds and some of our pollinators like bees. It also has a benefit for wildlife species like white-tailed deer and wild turkey that often thrive in kind of a matrix of closed canopy forest, forest edge, and then open areas like you find in these agricultural parcels. Just a handful of the birds that benefit from these open areas would include the grasshopper sparrow, the bobolink, but particularly I find interesting the eastern meadowlark. This is a bird that is an obligate ground feeder and nester. meaning it must find its food on the ground and it must nest on the ground. And because we've seen, or one of the reasons we've seen a decline in this species to the point that is now considered near threatened, it coincides with the decline of small farms and these open areas that there were once more prevalent throughout the southern Blue Ridge region that have subsequently, as people have left, have been encroached upon and closed in by forest. So our agricultural parcels along the parkway provide valuable habitat for animals like the eastern meadowlark, not just a place for people to raise agricultural products. So we kind of see the spillover effect here of something that has a historical and cultural objective associated with it, ultimately also having a benefit for the natural resources on the parkway. Okay, thank you all for your attention today. Special thanks to the Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation for inviting me. I'd like to thank my colleagues, Dr. Beth Davison here at App State, Joey Beretti, Tyler Sejbarth, and Mariah Van Voris, our recent graduates here at App State, and then my colleagues with the National Park Service, Bob Cherry, Tom Davis, who's really the lead on this project for the National Park Service, and then finally, Bambi Teague. So thanks for your attention. I'll turn things back over to Rita.
Thank you, Mark. That was wonderful. As you all can see, the park is very complex, 469 miles, 29 counties, and goes through 2 states. So there's a lot more than just what we see going on behind the scenes. So we have a few questions for you, Mark, and we'll try and get to as many of these as we can. The first one is, what happens if no one wants a parcel for a permit for a parcel, and does the National Park Service maintain the parcel, or does it go unmaintained?
I don't know that there are any right now that are not being used. That said, there are several that are no longer used for raising, specifically for agricultural purposes. Specifically, I'm thinking the Audubon has taken, North Carolina Audubon has taken charge of several of the parcels, and now the management emphasis is exclusively on bird life, like some of the species we just saw pictures of. But I'm not aware of right now any, and I could be wrong, I just may not know about it, any parcels that are not being used. That kind of answers it.
Yeah. Another question we had, do any permit holders collaborate on research with the National Park Service or App State or others? For example, testing different mowing or grazing practices, timing, to benefit declining grassland birds and specifically?
I don't know that any of the parcel permit holders are actively engaged in that research right now. I know that in the early days there was so with Abbott and others did little experiments on slope stability and stuff like that to see if what they thought were going to be agricultural parcels were really suitable for that. Of course, that's a long time ago. The question is probably more about the present day. I don't know of any of the permit holders that are actively engaged in research. There are outside of this project research efforts to look at pollinators, bird life, other taxa that may go into what the person's asking about. I hope I kind of answered that question.
And we had one person who was really impressed with the program, so that led me to want to ask, what do you guys have next on your horizons for the App State students? Anything in the works?
We have an ongoing bat survey, acoustic bat survey on Blue Ridge Parkway. I just turned in the report for the 2020 version last week. The 2021 field season is over. One of my colleagues in biology, Lynn Sieferman, is leading that right now. And there's talk of perhaps going back and doing a big study that ties in all the different acoustic bat surveys that have been done on the parkway, and kind of doing some broad scale analysis of that.